Chapter 14 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 14. 1807. The Campaign in Poland. A month after his arrival at Potsdam on the 21st of November, 1806, Napoleon issued the famous Berlin Decree which proclaimed war on British commerce. Great Britain was declared to be in a state of blockade. All commerce with her was forbidden, her goods were to be seized and her subjects imprisoned wherever found by French or Allied troops. This idea of strangling English commerce was not original with Napoleon. It was a pet scheme of the Jacobins, a part of the political stock in trade of the Revolution. The Berlin Decree has always been bitterly attacked by English historians, but it is now so much a matter of ancient history that it is hardly worth while to give any space to the controversy. The only question to be considered here is the underlying motive which influenced Napoleon, and this is a very difficult matter to determine. But there is no doubt as to the fatal effect upon his career of the enterprises to which this act led. The occupation of Spain and the Russian campaign, both of which adventures were prompted less by ambition than by the feeling that they were necessary to complete the triumph of his continental system. As Rose well says, this question of the underlying motive must at times cause every open-minded student of Napoleon's career to pause in utter doubt. While at Berlin, Napoleon took other steps to cement his power. He deposed the Elector of Hesse-Cassel and sent his troops to occupy the Electorate, which was subsequently incorporated in Jerome's kingdom of Westphalia. Towards Saxony he acted with great clemency. The Elector, in December, entered the Confederation of the Rhine with the title of king, and became an ally of the Emperor. On the day after the battle of Vienna, Frederick William sent an aide-de-camp to Napoleon to treat for peace, but the Emperor refused to consider the matter until he reached Berlin. Here he received the Prussian envoy, who had full powers to sign preliminaries of peace. But the conditions were so severe that the king refused to ratify the agreement when presented to him. Napoleon at first demanded all territory to the south of the Elbe up to the Magdeburg, and a war indemnity of 100 million francs. Later he increased his demands, and would only grant a suspension of hostilities, and even that under most oppressive conditions. The French to occupy the whole country up to the Bug River, 8 fortresses, including Danzig, to be surrendered, and the Russians to be ordered out of East Prussia. In order to weaken Russia, Napoleon now encouraged the Poles in their hopes for independence. To a Polish deputation which appeared at Berlin in November, he stated that France had never acknowledged the partition of their country, and that he would feel a deep interest in seeing the national sovereignty re-established. A week later he went in person to Posen to further stimulate the insurrection against the Czar. A feature of the situation very embarrassing to his plans was that Austria had participated with Prussia and Russia in the partition of Poland, and he could not at that time afford to add that power to the list of his foes. He accordingly suggested to the Austrian government an exchange of her Polish provinces for Silesia, which had been stolen from Maria Theresa by Frederick the Great. But Austria did not care to become involved in trouble with either of the belligerents, and declined the proposition. It is doubtful if Napoleon ever seriously thought of restoring the kingdom of Poland, no matter how strong his sympathies may have been with that oppressed people. It meant to take vast territories away from Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and incur the lasting enmity of those great powers, as against which the gratitude of Poland would count but little. The theater of the campaign of Poland, which now began, lies between the rivers Vistula and Niemen. The country for the most part is flat, marshy, and thickly wooded. In the field of the military operations of 1807 there were a number of lakes and many marshes. The Vistula, even at Warsaw, is a large stream several hundred yards wide. Below the city the river flows between low marshy banks. About 20 miles below Warsaw, the Bug joins the Vistula. Both rivers are military obstacles of importance, fordable only in seasons of drought. In this area there were only dirt roads, firm enough for artillery during the heat of summer or the frosts of winter, but almost impassable when soaked with rain or dissolved by thaws. During the mild weather of December, 1806, the infantry sank in the slush up to their knees, the guns to their axles. In the southern part of the theater of war, occupied by the Poles, the country was sparsely populated, and there were no large towns. Farther north, in the German-speaking territory, were found many villages, and there was a general air of prosperity. The climate was very trying, almost arctic in its severity in winter, and very hot in summer. In connection with military operations during the campaign, the terrain was of less importance than the climatic conditions. Within the theatre of operations at the opening of the campaign, there were still two important fortresses in the possession of Prussia: Danzig on the left bank of the Vistula near its mouth, a place of great strength, and Königsberg at the mouth of the Pregel, the capital of Old Prussia, a poorly fortified city, but an immense dépôt of stores of all sorts. After the pursuits succeeding Jena, Frederick William was compelled to retire behind the Vistula with the few troops he had left. His only remaining field army comprised less than 20,000 men, but he had some additional troops in garrison at Danzig and in other fortresses. The King himself took refuge at Königsberg, where he awaited a large Russian army which was marching to his aid. After the Peace of Presburg the Czar had still remained at war with France, and he was now the ally of Prussia. Napoleon at this time made peace overtures, but the Czar declined to consider them. For the moment, Napoleon knew nothing about the movements of the Russian army or its strength. At the end of the first week in November, however, news came that Bennigsen was advancing with 56,000 men, and would reach Thorn in the Vistula midway between Warsaw and Danzig by the middle of November. Napoleon at once gave orders for the concentration near Posen by the 18th of November, under the command of Murat, of the corps of Davout, Augereau, Lannes and Jérôme, the guard and part of the cavalry, about 80,000 men in all. Davout, on reaching Posen, however, found no signs of the Russians, and continued his march on Warsaw. Under Napoleon's directions the French army continued to advance, Ney and Bernadotte forming the left wing, Soult and Augereau the centre, and Davout and Lannes the right. The early winter of 1806 was unusually warm. It did not freeze, and the roads were in bad condition. Napoleon also found much trouble in supplying his army. He was not now in the valley of the Po or the Danube, and his men could not live off the country. Napoleon in person reached Warsaw on the 19th of December, and found that Bennigsen was at Pultus, about 30 miles to the north. He immediately headed his corps in that direction, and himself reached the front on the morning of the 23rd of December. He now adopted a plan of operations which is very puzzling to the student of his earlier campaigns. Instead of concentrating his forces in the way that had always won him success, he worked on exterior lines, and failed to strike the enemy a solid blow or beat him in detail. He was successful, however, in interposing the corps of Ney and Bernadotte between the Allies, and compelled the Prussians to retreat away from the Russian right towards Königsberg, but his reliance on Soult and Ney to come up in time to be of use proved vain. The bottomless roads were too great an obstacle. The battle of Pultusk, fought on the 26th of December, proved indecisive. The French, who were inferior in numbers, could make little progress against the stubborn resistance of the Russians. The short day, which would end at 4 o'clock, was made even shorter by the premature darkness due to the stormy, cloudy weather. During the night the Russians decided to retreat. Lannes, who had fought all day against double his numbers, was in no state to pursue. Both sides laid claims to this well contested battle. What ground Lannes gained, he lost again. Bennigsen, though he had repulsed the attack of a very inferior force, had not been able or had not dared to pursue it. But the French remained masters of the field, and could therefore claim the victory with better grace. With this battle the campaign practically ended, and both armies went into winter quarters. The question has often been asked, what importance did Napoleon attach to love affairs during his career? We read in one of the memoirs of the time, "The Emperor was very fond of women, but never allowed them to obtain any influence over his mind. He looked upon love as a diversion, and in this respect he could not have been more material, for the object of his affections of yesterday was as nothing to him on the morrow." Practically all of the information available on this subject has been brought together by Frédéric Masson in his work Napoléon et les femmes, and he mentions only about half a dozen liaisons, all of which, with one exception, were of a very brief duration. There was Madame Fouret in Egypt, and Grassini at Milan before Marengo; and there were also Mademoiselle Georges and Mademoiselle Desnuelles at Paris. In fact, Napoleon never at any time or in any place allowed women to interfere with affairs of war or state, and in this respect he set an excellent example to his marshals and ministers. He himself drew attention to Murat's conduct, and pointed out how he had committed many faults during his campaigns, owing to the fact that he liked to have his headquarters every evening in a château where there was a pretty woman. This abstinence on the part of Napoleon is all the more remarkable when we remember his age at the height of his career, and the constant temptation to which he was subjected. All the women of Europe were on their knees before the greatest man of his age. The only serious love affair of Napoleon was that with Madame Valeska, which began during the campaign in Poland, and only ended with his departure for St. Helena. This was no ordinary amour. She was his Polish wife. His wife in all but name. The first day of January, 1807, when Napoleon was returning from Pultus to Warsaw, he stopped a moment at the gate of the little city of Brony to change horses. Duroc descended from the carriage and pushed his way to the post house through an enthusiastic crowd which had gathered to see the liberator of Poland. Here a voice said to him in French, "Monsieur, can you not arrange for me to speak to the Emperor a moment?" The lady who had addressed him seemed almost a child. She was blonde, with large, innocent blue eyes. Her beautiful face, fresh as a rose, was flushed with excitement. Her figure was small but perfectly proportioned, and very graceful. She was very simply dressed, and wore a black hat with a heavy veil. Duroc conducted her to the door of the carriage, and said to Napoleon, "Here is a lady who has braved all the dangers of the crowd for you." The Emperor took off his hat and began to speak to her, but she did not allow him to finish, and, carried away by her enthusiasm, she wished him 1,000 welcomes to her native land, and expressed her pleasure and her gratitude for what he had done to uplift it. Taking a bouquet which he had in the carriage, Napoleon presented it to her, saying, "Gardez-le comme garant de mes bonnes intentions. Nous nous reverrons à Varsovie, je l'espère, et je réclamerai un merci de votre belle bouche." This young lady was Marie Valeska. Of an old but impoverished Polish family, at the age of 16 she had married the head of one of the most illustrious families of Poland, a man 70 years of age, who had a grandchild 9 years older than herself. Since then 2 years had passed. All Poland was now agitated over the visit of the Emperor to Warsaw, which might decide the fate of the nation. Waleski, who was as intensely patriotic as his young wife, went there and opened his mansion. The Emperor was staying at Leblaha, the palace of Prince Poniatowski. After many inquiries, Duroc finally succeeded in ascertaining the name of the belle inconnue of the post house of Brony, and the prince called one afternoon in person to invite her to a ball to be given at the palace. She refused, and he insisted, but she would not yield. Finally she was persuaded to go at the request of her husband, joined to that of some of the most influential magnates of the country, who said, "Who knows but that Heaven will make use of you to re establish our native land?" Immediately after the ball, Napoleon began to write her daily in terms of warm but respectful admiration, and to shower her with presents of all kinds; but she would neither answer his letters nor accept his gifts. Her coldness only increased the ardor of the Emperor, who had never yet known defeat in love or war. Finally, yielding to the importunities of all around her, her family, the chief magistrates of Poland, even her husband, all of whom told her that the fate of her country was in her hands, Marie, whispering, "I will ne'er consent," consented. In the words of Masson, she was not to be for Napoleon une maîtresse de passage, but a sort of épouse à côté, who would not participate, it is true, either in the dignities of the crown or the splendors of the throne, but who would occupy a special rank, who would be the envoy of her people nearer to the Emperor, sa femme polonaise. During the time that he passed at Warsaw before the battle of Eylau, Napoleon saw her daily. When he transported his headquarters in the spring to Finkenstein, she joined him there. When he returned to France after the treaty of Tilsit, she at first refused to follow him because he had disappointed her hopes for Poland, but she finally yielded to his entreaties. During the campaign of 1809 she went to Vienna, where she lived in a house prepared for her near the Palace of Schönbrunn. After the Peace of Vienna she returned to her home in Poland, where was born on the 4th of May, 1810, her son by the Emperor, Alexander Waleski. At the end of the same year she returned to Paris, where she finally took up her residence at 48 Rue de la Victoire, only a few doors from Napoleon's first home in the city. The Emperor gave his son the title of Comte, and settled upon him an income of 50,000 francs. The boy was a great favorite of Josephine's, who frequently sent for him and his mother to visit her at Malmaison. In August, 1814, she paid a visit to the Emperor on the island of Elba, and as soon as she heard of his return to France she went to Paris, and was with him at the Élysée and at Malmaison up to the moment of his final departure. But after Napoleon was sent to St. Helena she felt herself free. Her husband having died 2 years before, in 1816, at Liège, where she was living after the second return of the Bourbons, she married a cousin of the Emperor's, General Comte d'Ornano, one of the most brilliant officers of the Grand Army. Marie did not long enjoy her new happiness. She died at her hotel in the Rue de la Victoire the 15th of December the following year, at the early age of 28. When Napoleon heard at St. Helena of her marriage he was much affected. She was the one great love of his life, and he always felt for her the deepest attachment. With her death, for him was severed the last tie of earthly affection. Josephine, the wife of his youth, was gone, and the ignoble Marie Louise was living in open concubinage with Comte de Nepergue. The brilliant career of their son Alexander Walewski under the Second Empire is well known. His life, as a soldier, writer, diplomat, and statesman, forms part of the history of the 19th century. After the battle of Pultus, orders were issued for the army to go into cantonments, and on the 7th of January the detailed plans for winter quarters were given out. Bernadotte was to guard the lower Vistula and cut the Russians off from Danzig. Ney was to protect the approaches to Thorn, with his headquarters at that place. The other corps under Soult, Augereau, Davout, and Lannes were to protect other strategic points. The Guard and general headquarters were at Warsaw, where the Emperor returned on the first day of January. In case the enemy should advance during the winter, orders were issued indicating the points at which the 7 corps were to rendezvous. Great magazines were erected and abundant supplies procured. "The curtain thus fell," says Dodge, "on the first memorable campaign, which should have taught Napoleon more about Russia and its people, about the Czar and his soldiers, than it really did." After the battle of Pultus, the Russians retired about half way to Grodno on the Niemen, where the 2 corps were united under the command of Bennigsen. Napoleon at once made vigorous efforts to put his army on a sound footing for the reopening of hostilities, and soon had 150,000 men at his disposal. The winter was unusually mild for Poland, and Napoleon hoped the campaign would not open before spring. In this he was doomed to disappointment. Bennigsen had formed the plan of attacking Ney and Bernadotte, who were on the lower Vistula, driving them across the river, and seizing Danzig. He would thus secure better winter quarters in East Prussia, and be in a favorable position at the opening of the next campaign. He had been reinforced, and now had about 60,000 men. After meeting with some success in his forward movement, the Russian commander suddenly abandoned his scheme, and decided to fall back and again put his troops into cantonments. Notwithstanding his reluctance to undertake a winter campaign, this move of the Russians determined Napoleon to begin an offensive operation of his own. Having divined Bennigsen's intention, he proposed to move around his rear and drive him into the angle between the Vistula and the sea. Napoleon marched against the enemy with the cavalry under Murat and the 4 corps of Davout, Augereau, Ney, and Soult, about 80,000 men. Bernadotte was to hold the Vistula. Napoleon's plans were well laid, and there was prospect of another Jena. There now happened one of those unfortunate accidents which sometimes occur in war and upset the ablest calculations. A dispatch from the Emperor to Bernadotte, giving him in detail the whole plan of operations, and prescribing his own movements, failed to reach the Marshal and fell into the hands of the enemy. The Russian commander was thus on the 1st of February put in full possession of the French plans, while Bernadotte remained for several days in complete ignorance of the general operations. The Marshal consequently did not move, and Bennigsen made haste to get out of the trap prepared for him. He rapidly drew his troops together at Allenstein, where Napoleon attacked him on the 2nd of February. he immediately fell back, and after a retreat of 3 days reached Eylau, where the roads to Königsberg and Friedland divide. There he saw that he must make a stand if he was to save his army from complete disorganization. On the 7th the French centre column drove the Russian rearguard into the town, and the French army advanced and took up its position opposite the town. There were in and about the village the corps of Murat, Soult, and Augereau, and the Guard, while Ney and Davout were half a day's march away. The Emperor bivouacked on the hill behind Eylau, uncertain whether the Russians would stand on the morrow or continue their retreat. The main Russian army of about 80,000 men was drawn up on the plain along the low plateau 1,000 yards east and north of Eylau. There were many low hills, and many brooks and ponds, which were frozen over and covered with snow. The forces were not far from equal, but Davout and Ney had not yet arrived, and the Emperor had only 60,000 men at his disposal. Though not superior in force, as he always preferred to be, Napoleon resolved to attack, and felt sure of success. The Russians had been retreating for a week, and most troops under such conditions would be pretty well demoralized. But Napoleon had never yet seen the Russian soldier at his best, that is, in reverse. The French army also had been marching for a week with little or no shelter, and was much fatigued. The battle began with a heavy cannonade by the Russians, who were much superior in this arm. Then they attempted to recapture the town of Eylau, which had been taken by Soult at the point of the bayonet the evening before, and there was serious fighting in the streets and gardens of the little town. Davout was ordered by the Emperor to attack the Russian left, and Augereau was sent forward to support him, but lost his way in a blizzard, and his corps was almost annihilated. Nevertheless, Davout was finally successful in overpowering the Russian left wing, which he drove back until it formed a right angle with the morning position. During the night the Russians decided to retreat, and Bennigsen, hotly pursued by Murat and Ney, reached Königsberg 2 days after the battle. The losses on both sides were enormous, and for once Napoleon failed to follow up his success and gather the full fruit of his victory. Even his endurance had found a limit. This winter campaign had been forced on him by the Russian offensive, and he was glad to be able to put his troops again in winter quarters. Napoleon selected Osterode for his headquarters, and here for weeks he shared all the privations of his men. At first he had to be satisfied with a barn for his dwelling place until something more suitable could be found. It was not until he moved to the castle of Finkenstein in April that his quarters became more comfortable. His cheerfulness under these hardships was an example to his officers and men. After Eylau, Napoleon opened negotiations for peace with Frederick William, and offered to restore all of his territory north of the Elbe if he would conclude a separate treaty of peace with France. But the king refused, and in April signed a new treaty with Russia. The Emperor next turned to Austria, and offered great concessions to that government in return for its alliance. But the Emperor Francis decided to remain neutral, and refused as before to side with either of the belligerents. The French troops passed the rest of the winter quietly in their quarters on the Passarge. Supplies were obtained from the base at Thorn. Keen attention was paid to the maintenance of discipline and the employment of the men so as to avoid idleness. After the fall of Danzig the question of supplies was made much easier. Lefebvre with his corps had invested the place about the middle of March, and it finally surrendered the 25th of May. His corps was then broken up to reinforce Mortier, and a reserve corps was formed under the command of Lannes, in place of Augereau's corps, which suffered so severely at Eylau that it had to be disbanded. The Russians under Bennigsen had been in cantonments since March along the river Al. Later he moved forward to Heilsberg. After the fall of Danzig, Napoleon, who had been heavily reinforced, had in hand 5 corps, with the Guard and Lannes Reserve Corps, a total of about 170,000 men. Another corps of about 30,000 men was near Pultus under Masséna, who had been called up from Italy. Other detachments brought the army up to a total of 285,000 men. The main Russian army under Bennigsen comprised about 90,000 men, with 20,000 Prussians in addition under Lestock, and there were also about 50,000 Russians in reserve in the rear. The Emperor was only waiting for the fall of Danzig before resuming active operations. On the 5th of June he issued orders for the whole army to be ready to advance at the end of 5 days. The Russians, however, anticipated his attack. For some time the Czar had been pressing Bennigsen to advance, but he felt that he was not sufficiently prepared. At length the complaints became so loud that he resolved to assume the offensive. The first week in June he began an advance in 3 columns from Augsburg. His plan was to take advantage of Ney's exposed position and throw the bulk of his army upon him. News of this advance movement reached Napoleon at Finkenstein on the 5th at midday, and the same evening he issued new orders for the concentration of his main body under Murat, Lannes, Mortier, and Davout between Osterode and Saalfeld, to which line Ney and Soult were to fall back if hard pressed. The same day Bennigsen attacked Ney, who fell back slowly. The Emperor, finding that Ney was holding his own, now ordered the other corps to converge at a point further forward on the line of advance. Seeing such large forces massing in support of Ney, the Russians abandoned the offensive and retreated to Augsburg. Here Napoleon attacked them in their entrenched position on the 10th with his right wing Murat, Soult, and Lannes. But their position was too strong, and he broke off the engagement to await the arrival of the other corps. Bennigsen immediately abandoned his position and retreated to Friedland, where he arrived 2 days later. On the 14th of June, Bennigsen resolved to fall on the advance corps of Lannes and check the French movement towards Königsberg. He therefore threw his main body across to the left bank of the Alle, and this led on the anniversary of Marengo to the decisive battle of Friedland between 80,000 French and 60,000 Russians. The road from Eylau slopes gradually downwards towards the Alle, on the left bank of which stands the little town of Friedland. 2 miles before it is reached a slight elevation in the rear of Posthonen affords a clear view over the entire battlefield, and down to the village lying directly in front of the spectator. Just before reaching Friedland, the Alle makes a horseshoe turn towards the west, on the north side of which the town is located. There was one important feature of the landscape which was at once recognized by Napoleon on his arrival. A small brook, known as the Mill Stream, rising a little to the west, takes a course direct to Friedland, where it expands into a semicircular pond covering the north side of the town, which is thus built at the end of a peninsula. This stream divides the plain into 2 sections. Flowing between steep banks, although narrow, it is a serious obstacle to the free movement of troops. On the day of the battle the whole surface of the open, gently undulating plain was covered with crops of winter wheat and rye. This detail will be remarked in the celebrated painting of the battle by Meissonier, which now hangs in the Metropolitan Museum at New York. When the battle began at 9 o'clock in the morning, Lannes had only 17,000 men on the field to face nearly 3 times as many Russians. An hour later Mortier's corps arrived, and the numbers were more nearly even. The Emperor reached the field about noon, and from the elevation near Posthonen surveyed the ground. On this bright summer morning the scene was very different from that which he had witnessed under the wintry sky of Eylau 4 months before. He at once grasped the salient features of the battlefield, and saw the weakness of the Russian position, with their corps separated by the Mill Stream and a deep unfordable river in the rear, crossed by only one permanent bridge. Napoleon had sufficient force in hand to hold off the enemy, and he decided not to press the fight until Ney, Victor, and the Guard arrived. Until 5 o'clock the action on both sides was maintained chiefly by the artillery. Then, the Guard and Victor having come up, Napoleon ordered the attack to begin. By 8 o'clock Ney was in possession of Friedland, and the battle was won. The Russians suffered very severe losses in their retreat over the only bridge that was left open to them. There was no pursuit of the demoralized Russians, which was contrary to Napoleon's usual practice. The explanation probably is that he was influenced by political considerations. A pursuit such as that of the Prussians after Jena would have inflicted very heavy losses on the enemy, but would also have caused very bitter feelings. Napoleon did not want to make a permanent enemy of the Czar. He already had in mind the Russian alliance, which was soon to be concluded. On the 19th of June Napoleon reached Tilsit, nearly 60 miles from Friedland. His army had marched 140 miles in 13 days, fighting 2 battles on the way. At Tilsit, Napoleon proposed a personal meeting between the Czar and himself to arrange the terms of peace. An enormous raft was constructed by the French engineers and moored in midstream. On the 25th of June, at 1 o'clock, Napoleon, accompanied by Murat, Berthier, Bessieres, Duroc, and Caulaincourt, left one bank of the river at the same moment that Alexander, with the Grand Duke Constantine, Bennigsen, and 3 aides de camp, left the other. The 2 emperors met on the raft, embraced, and then entered on a discussion which lasted 2 hours. By the Treaty of Tilsit, signed on the 7th of July, Prussia was reduced to the territory lying between the Elbe and the Oder. From her share of the ancient kingdom of Poland was formed the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. The new kingdom of Westphalia was formed out of Prussian lands west of the Elbe, and bestowed upon Jerome. The 14th of May, at Finkenstein, Napoleon was informed by a special courier of the death at the Hague, 9 days before, of Napoleon Charles, the eldest son of Louis and Hortense. The little Prince Royal of Holland was attacked by the croup on the evening of the 4th, and died at 10 o'clock the following night. His grandmother Josephine had cherished the hope that he would one day inherit the imperial throne. The child was remarkable for his intelligence and beauty, and was much beloved by the Emperor, whom he strongly resembled. The grief of Josephine was intense. She did not dare to leave the territory of the Empire without the permission of the Emperor, but she went at once to the Chateau of Laeken, near Brussels, whence she wrote Hortense to come and join her. Louis and Hortense, with their only remaining son, Napoleon Louis, then 2½ years old, arrived at Laeken the next evening. A few days later, the Empress returned to Paris with Hortense and her child. After a short stay at Malmaison, Hortense left for Cauterets in the Pyrenees to take the waters for her health. Here she was rejoined by her husband, and for the last time they resumed their life in common. 9 months later, at the town house of Queen Hortense, 8 Rue Cheruti, now the Rue Lafitte, Paris, was born their 3rd and youngest son, Louis Napoleon, afterwards the Emperor Napoleon III. On the 28th of July, 1807, the Emperor, who had arrived the previous evening at St. Cloud, received the grand dignitaries of the state, who came to offer their felicitations. The victor of Austerlitz, of Vienna, and of Friedland, the conqueror of the 3 greatest nations of the continent, was then at the height of his power. The dominions, directly or indirectly under his control, extended from the Vistula to the Strait of Gibraltar, from the North Sea to the mountains of Bohemia, from the Alps to the Adriatic. Not even Charlemagne had ever ruled so great an empire. The fête of Napoleon, 15th of August, was celebrated that year with unusual splendor. In the evening the Emperor appeared on the balcony of the Tuileries holding the hand of Josephine, and was acclaimed by an immense crowd which filled the illuminated gardens. A week later was celebrated the marriage of Jerome with the young Princess Catherine of Würtemberg. Napoleon had had much difficulty in securing the annulment of his brother's marriage with Miss Patterson. The Pope had replied to the request of the Emperor by a formal refusal. But the French authorities were more amenable, and in October, 1806, he obtained a decree which pronounced the marriage null and void. The King of Würtemberg, who owed his crown to Napoleon, was a regular Colossus. The Queen, who was the stepmother of Catherine, was the daughter of King George III., and she was naturally opposed to the marriage. She did not venture, however, to raise any objections. Jerome, who was the youngest of the Bonapartes, and also the most worthless, had just received from his brother the crown of Westphalia. Born at Ajaccio the 15th of November, 1784, he was nearly 2 years younger than his bride. The princess was a woman of much charm, who inspired the sympathy and respect of everybody. She was tall and beautiful, affable in her manners, and of superior intelligence. Notwithstanding Jerome's notorious infidelities, in 1814 she refused to divorce him, and clung to her unfortunate husband, the dethroned king. She won both the love and admiration of Napoleon, who, at St. Helena, spoke of her in the highest terms. The marriage was first celebrated by procuration at Stuttgart. The princess arrived at the Chateau of Raincy, where she saw her fiancé for the first time, the 20th of August, and at the Tuileries the next day. The civil marriage was celebrated on the 22nd in the Galerie de Diane, in the presence of the Emperor and the Empress and of all the great personages of the Empire. The religious ceremony was performed the following evening in the chapel of the Tuileries by the Archbishop of Ratisbon, the Prince Primate of the Confederation of the Rhine. The court arrived at the Château of Fontainebleau the 21st of September, and remained there 8 weeks. During the First Empire, the fêtes at Fontainebleau and Compiègne were much more formal than under the Second Empire. Napoleon III was a charming host, and his guests all enjoyed themselves. But the great Emperor was more feared than loved, and his guests came as a matter of duty rather than of pleasure. He almost always dined alone, and it was a special honor, rarely extended even to princes, to be invited to his table. The hunts of the Second Empire were quite simple, while those of the First were magnificent. There was very little etiquette under Napoleon III, but during the First Empire it was rigorous. The Emperor gave the order that all were to enjoy themselves, and he could not understand why every one had an air of ennui. Chapter 15